Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are not against enemies, but against the cruel hand that life deals us when we least expect it. For Sarah McKinnon, that battle began the day they lowered her husband into the Wyoming soil, leaving her with nothing but debt, a failing ranch, and a daughter who still asks when Papa is coming home. The bank wants $3,000 in 30 days, or they'll take everything. At 28, Sarah has already buried one love and built walls around her heart that no man could climb. Then Jacob Stone rides up to her door. He's a wealthy rancher with calloused hands and honest eyes, carrying an offer that sounds too good to be true. "I'll pay your debts if you'll wear my ring," he says simply. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. She keeps her ranch, he gets a wife in name only. But in the wild heart of the Old West, some promises have a way of becoming something deeper. Can two wounded souls find healing in each other's company? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming wind carried memories across the prairie like tumbleweeds, and Sarah McKinnon caught them all. Standing at her kitchen window, she watched dust devils dance across the pasture where Thomas used to train his horses, where he'd laugh and call out to her about dinner getting cold while he worked past sunset. That was before the fever took him, before the world turned upside down and left her holding pieces of a life that no longer fit together. She twisted the simple gold band on her finger, his ring, the one he'd placed there 7 years ago, with promises of forever. Forever had lasted exactly 5 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Now it served as both comfort and reminder of what she'd lost, what she'd never risk losing again. "Mama, why are you sad?" Emma's voice drifted from the kitchen table where she sat with her slate, practicing letters that wobbled like her voice when she asked about Papa. "Not sad, sweetheart, just thinking." Sarah turned from the window, forcing a smile for her 6-year-old daughter. Emma had Thomas's dark hair and serious brown eyes, but lately those eyes held questions that cut straight through Sarah's heart. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of Wyoming territory, from the Sweetwater River to the rocky hills that glowed gold at sunset. Thomas had bought it with dreams bigger than his pocketbook, plans for a horse breeding operation that would make them wealthy. Instead, it had made them poor. The land was good, the water reliable, but dreams didn't pay bills, and Thomas's gentle nature had made him an easy mark for men with harder hearts and sharper business sense. Sarah moved to the kitchen table where papers lay, scattered like fallen leaves bills, notices, letters from the bank. Each one carried the same message: pay or lose everything. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. The ranch brought in barely enough to cover food and basic supplies, let alone the mounting debts Thomas had accumulated, trying to build something lasting for his family. She pulled out a letter from the wooden box beside the papers, its edges soft from handling. Thomas's handwriting sprawled across the page in familiar loops and curves. "My dearest Sarah, another beautiful morning on our land. Watching you tend the garden reminds me why I work so hard. This place will be our legacy, something to pass down to Emma and her children. All my love, always, Thomas." He'd written it the spring before he died, full of hope and plans that would never come to pass. Sarah had dozens of such letters, words of love and dreams tucked away like pressed flowers. They were all she had left of the man who'd loved her with such fierce devotion, who'd seen something worthwhile in a schoolteacher's daughter from a failing farm back in Missouri. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her reverie. Through the window, she watched a lone rider approach, sitting easy in his saddle like a man comfortable with long distances and his own company. Something about his bearing made her step back from the window, though she couldn't say why. Emma scrambled onto a chair to peer out. "Mama, there's a man coming, a big man on a big horse." Sarah's chest tightened. Strangers usually brought bad news bill collectors, bank representatives, men with legal papers, and no patience for explanations. She smoothed her worn calico dress and checked that her hair was properly pinned. Whatever this visitor wanted, she'd meet it with dignity intact. The rider dismounted at the gate, removing his hat in a gesture of respect before approaching the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair showing grey at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. His clothes were well made, but practical leather vest, clean shirt, boots that had seen honest work. Most notably, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that actions carried weight. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, keeping Emma behind her. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" "Mrs. McKinnon." He held his hat against his chest, and his voice carried the slow cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "My name is Jacob Stone. I own the ranch north of Casper Creek. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." She knew the name, though they'd never met. Jacob Stone's spread was one of the largest in the territory, and his reputation for fair dealing and hard work preceded him. What such a man wanted with her failing operation was beyond her understanding. "I suppose that would be all right. Please come in." He followed her into the modest parlor, his presence somehow making the room seem smaller. Emma peeked around Sarah's skirt, curious about this stranger who seemed to fill the space with quiet authority. "You have a beautiful daughter," Jacob said, crouching to Emma's eye level. "What's your name, little miss?" "Emma Rose McKinnon," she replied with careful pronunciation, the way Sarah had taught her. "I'm 6 years old and I can write my whole name." "That's quite an accomplishment." Jacob's smile transformed his serious features, revealing genuine warmth. "I have a mare at my place who just had a foal, black as midnight with white stockings. Maybe your mama would bring you to see him sometime." Emma's eyes widened with delight, but Sarah felt a familiar twist of pain. Thomas had promised Emma a pony, another dream that died with him. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Stone, but I'm afraid we don't have time for social visits these days." Sarah's tone came out sharper than intended. "You said you had business with me." Jacob straightened, his expression growing serious again. "Yes, ma'am. I heard about your troubles with the bank. Word travels in small communities." Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. The shame of their circumstances being common knowledge made her stomach churn. "I don't see how our private affairs concern you, Mr. Stone." "They concern me because I have a proposition that might benefit us both." He glanced at Emma, who was listening with the intense concentration children brought to adult conversations they sensed were important. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Men with propositions for desperate widows rarely had honorable intentions. But something in Jacob Stone's manner suggested otherwise, a respectfulness that reminded her of Thomas, though everything else about him spoke of strength where her husband had possessed gentleness. "Emma, why don't you go practice your letters in the kitchen? Mr. Stone and I need to discuss grown-up matters." Once Emma had reluctantly departed, Jacob took the chair Sarah indicated, though he perched on its edge as if ready to leave at the first sign of offense. "Mrs. McKinnon, I'll speak plainly because I believe you're a woman who values honesty. I know you're facing foreclosure. I know you're trying to save this ranch on your own, and I respect that. But I also know you can't do it alone." Sarah's spine stiffened. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." "Are you?" His question held no judgment, only gentle challenge. "When was the last time you had enough money to buy Emma new shoes? When did you last eat meat that wasn't rabbit you caught yourself? When did you stop worrying about whether the roof would hold through another winter?" Each question hit like a physical blow, because each was true. Sarah's silence was answer enough. Jacob leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I have a solution, if you're willing to hear it. I need a wife. You need financial security. I'm proposing a business arrangement marriage in name only, with terms that protect both our interests." Sarah's mouth fell open. Of all the propositions she'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. "Mr. Stone, I think you should leave. Please hear me out." His voice remained calm, reasonable. "I'm 35 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years building a ranch that can support a family. But I've never found a woman willing to share that lifno, really. The territory is hard on women, and most prefer the comfort of eastern cities to the challenges of frontier life. I've made peace with bachelorhood, but lately I've realized I need more than just business success." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "You, on the other hand, have proven you can handle frontier life. You've kept this place running for 2 years on your own, raised a fine daughter, and earned the respect of everyone in the community. You're exactly the kind of woman who could make a success of marriage on the frontier if the circumstances were right." Sarah found her voice, though it came out strained. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A marriage of convenience. I pay off your debts, provide for you and Emma, and in return, you manage my household and present yourself as my wife in public. Separate bedrooms, separate lives in private. You keep this ranch as your property. I'll have the papers drawn up to ensure it remains legally yours. If the arrangement doesn't work for either of us after a year, we can dissolve the marriage and you'll still have your land free and clear." The proposal was so matter-of-fact, so businesslike, that Sarah almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she stared at this strange man who spoke of marriage like a cattle transaction. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" Something shifted in Jacob's expression, a flicker of emotion quickly controlled. "Because I knew your husband, Mrs. McKinnon. We weren't close friends, but we had dealings from time to time. Thomas McKinnon was a good man who loved his family more than his own life. I figure if he thought you were worth loving, you probably are." The simple statement hit Sarah harder than any elaborate declaration could have. She looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring that felt suddenly heavy. "I need time to think," she whispered. "Of course." Jacob stood, hat in hand once again. "But don't take too long. I understand the bank wants their money by month's end. That's 18 days from now." As if she could forget, as if the counting of days hadn't become as regular as breathing, each sunset bringing them closer to losing everything Thomas had worked for. After Jacob left, Sarah sat alone in the parlor as shadows lengthened across the floor. Through the kitchen doorway, she could hear Emma humming as she practiced her letters, innocent of the weight pressing down on her mother's shoulders. The child deserved stability, security, a future that didn't depend on the whims of weather and the cruelty of circumstance. But marriage, even a marriage of convenience, felt like betrayal. Thomas had been her great love, the man who'd swept her off her feet with poetry and promises. How could she even consider standing before God and pledging herself to another, no matter how practical the arrangement? Yet as the last light faded from the western sky, Sarah found herself thinking not of betrayal, but of survival. And for the first time in 2 years, survival seemed possible. The knock came at dawn, sharp and official, the kind that made Sarah's heart sink before she even opened the door. She'd been up since before sunrise, unable to sleep for the 3rd night, running, wrestling with Jacob Stone's impossible proposition. Now, facing the stern countenance of Harold Pritchard from the Territorial Bank, she realized time for wrestling was over. "Mrs. McKinnon." Pritchard removed his bowler hat with perfunctory politeness, but his pale eyes held no warmth. Behind him stood a younger man with a leather satchel and the predatory look of someone who enjoyed other people's misfortunes. "I believe you know why I'm here." Sarah tightened her wrapper around her nightgown, acutely aware that she was receiving official business in her sleeping clothes. But dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Mr. Pritchard, rather early for a social call, isn't it?" "This isn't a social call, ma'am. This is business." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket, its official seal catching the morning light like a threat. "Final notice of foreclosure. You have 14 days to satisfy your debt in full, or the bank will exercise its right to claim this property in lieu of payment." 14 days, not 18, as she'd been counting. Somewhere in her calculations, she'd lost track of time, precious time that might have made the difference between desperation and disaster. "I thought I had until the end of the month," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "The final payment was due end of business yesterday, Mrs. McKinnon. We've extended considerable patience already, given your circumstances." Pritchard's tone suggested his patience was a rare and valuable commodity, grudgingly dispensed. But the reality is, this bank has obligations to its investors. We cannot continue to carry bad debt indefinitely. Sarah took the foreclosure notice with hands that barely trembled. She'd been expecting this moment for months, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. And if I can raise the money, all of it? $3,247, including accumulated interest and fees. The younger man spoke for the first time, consulting a ledger with obvious satisfaction. Plus, an additional $50 for each day beyond the deadline. Over $3,000. Sarah's entire world could be measured in dozens of eggs to sell, dozens of vegetables from her garden, dozens of small economies that never seemed to add up to enough. $3,000 might as well be $3 million. I understand your position, Pritchard continued, though his tone suggested understanding was another luxury he couldn't afford to dispense freely. You're a young woman with a child to consider. Perhaps it would be wise to accept reality and make arrangements for your future elsewhere. There are opportunities for a woman of your circumstances, in the growing towns, domestic service, perhaps, or there's always California. I understand there's still gold to be found for those willing to work hard. The suggestion that she abandon her home, Thomas's ranch, everything they'd built together, sent a spike of anger through Sarah's chest. But beneath the anger lay something colder and more dangerous, the recognition that Pritchard might be right. What future did she have here anyway? What could she offer Emma besides poverty and struggle? "Mama?" Emma's sleepy voice drifted from the kitchen doorway. She stood in her white nightgown, dark hair tousled, clutching the rag doll Thomas had made for her last Christmas. "What's happening?" Sarah's heart clenched. Emma shouldn't have to witness this, shouldn't have to see her mother's shame and desperation laid bare before strangers. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just some business to discuss. Go get dressed, and I'll fix your breakfast in a moment." But Emma didn't move. Her dark eyes, so like Thomas's, moved from her mother to the two men and back again. Children had an instinct for recognizing when their world was shifting beneath their feet. "Are we going to lose the ranch, Mama?" The question came out in a whisper, but it hit the morning air like a gunshot. Sarah couldn't answer, couldn't lie to those trusting eyes, but couldn't bear to confirm her daughter's worst fears either. Pritchard cleared his throat impatiently. "Mrs. McKinnon, I need your acknowledgement of receipt of this notice. Sign here, please." He held out a pen, with the efficiency of a man who'd performed this ritual many times before. Sarah signed her name with careful script, each letter feeling like a small defeat. The men departed without further ceremony, leaving her standing in her doorway with a legal document that spelled out her ruin in precise, unforgiving language. "Mama, I'm scared." Emma had crept closer, and now she wrapped her small arms around Sarah's waist. "I don't want to leave Papa's ranch." Sarah gathered her daughter close, breathing in the warm scent of her hair, the innocence that still clung to her despite everything. "I know, baby, I know." But knowing and doing something about it were different things entirely. Sarah spent the morning in a kind of trance, going through the motions of daily life while her mind raced through impossible scenarios. She could write to her sister in Missouri, beg for help that Elizabeth didn't have to give. She could sell everything of value: Thomas's books, her mother's china, the furniture they'd bought in the early days when the future seemed bright and limitless. But even if she liquidated everything, she might raise a few $100s at most. By afternoon, when Jacob Stone appeared at her gate again, Sarah was ready to listen. This time, he didn't dismount. He sat his horse easily, hat tipped against the sun, waiting for her to approach him. The gesture showed respect for her privacy, acknowledgement that yesterday's conversation had changed things between them. "I heard Pritchard paid you a visit this morning," Jacob said without preamble. "News travels fast in small towns." 14 days, Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Not 18. Jacob nodded gravely. "I can have the money to the bank by tomorrow morning if you're willing." Such simple words, but they carried the weight of transformation. Sarah looked back at the ranch house, at Emma playing with her doll on the front porch, at the pasture where Thomas's dreams had taken root and withered. Everything familiar, everything she'd fought to preserve, could be saved with a single word. "What would you expect from me?" she asked quietly. "Exactly what I said yesterday. A wife in name and public appearance. Someone to manage my household, attend social functions, present a respectable front to the community. In private, we maintain separate lives and separate bedrooms. You keep this ranch as your own property, and I provide for you and Emma's needs. And if it doesn't work out, then we end the arrangement amicably, and you keep everything the ranch, a settlement that ensures your future security. I'm not looking to trap you, Mrs. McKinnon. I'm looking for partnership, not possession." Sarah studied his face, searching for deception, for hidden motives, for the cruelty that experience had taught her to expect from men who made generous offers. Instead, she found only patience and something that might have been understanding. "Why me?" she asked. "You could have your pick of women, younger women, women without the complications I bring." Jacob's smile was rueful. "Maybe, but younger women come with different complications. They want romance, passion, the kind of love I'm not sure I'm capable of giving. You understand loss, understand that sometimes practical arrangements serve better than grand gestures. And Emma." He looked toward the porch, where the little girl was watching them with curious eyes. "Every child deserves security. Thomas's daughter deserves that most of all." Again, the mention of her husband, the suggestion that Jacob's offer somehow honored Thomas's memory rather than betraying it. Sarah felt the tight band around her chest loosen slightly. "I need one condition," she said suddenly. "Name it. Emma can never know this is just a business arrangement. If we do this, she has to believe it's real, that you care for her, that we're a real family. I won't have her grow up feeling like charity, like something you tolerated for my sake." Jacob's expression softened. "Mrs. McKinnon, any man would be proud to call that little girl his daughter. That won't be pretense." For the first time since Pritchard's visit, Sarah felt she could breathe fully, not because the decision was easy, but because it was suddenly clear. Emma deserved a future that didn't hang by the thread of her mother's pride. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, Mr. Stone, I accept your proposal." Jacob dismounted then, approaching her with the same careful respect he'd shown from the beginning. "There are details to work out: the ceremony, living arrangements, legal papers. But first, I want you to understand something." He paused, seeming to choose his words with particular care. "This arrangement doesn't diminish what you had with Thomas. I'm not trying to replace him or compete with his memory. I'm simply offering you and Emma a different kind of future." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The weight of the decision settled over her like a heavy coat, protective but constraining. As Jacob rode away, Sarah remained in the yard, watching dust settle in his wake. Through the kitchen window, she could see Emma at the table, carefully practicing her letters. In 14 days, if all went according to plan, that little girl would have a stepfather, a secure home, and a future that stretched beyond the horizon of her mother's desperate calculations. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that in saving Emma's world, she was about to lose herself completely. The marriage contract arrived 3 days later, delivered by Jacob's lawyer from Cheyenne, thin, efficient man named Horace Caldwell, who spread the papers across Sarah's kitchen table like a dealer laying out cards. Each page represented another aspect of her future, reduced to legal terminology and witnessed signatures. "Mr. Stone has been most specific about the terms," Caldwell explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Your ranch remains entirely in your name, with full mineral and water rights. Mr. Stone assumes all existing debts and provides a monthly household allowance of $50, plus additional funds for Emma's education and any medical needs that may arise." $50 a month. Sarah tried not to show her amazement. Before Thomas died, they'd considered themselves fortunate when they cleared $15 in a good month. "And my obligations?" she asked, scanning the precise handwriting that laid out her new life in orderly paragraphs. "Household management of Mr. Stone's primary residence, social appearances as required, and Caldwell cleared his throat delicately. Presentation of a united domestic front in all public matters. Quite standard for arrangements of this nature. Arrangements of this nature. The phrase made their agreement sound commonplace, as if half the marriages in Wyoming territory were founded on financial necessity rather than affection. Perhaps that wasn't far from the truth. Emma wandered in from the parlor, clutching her slate and regarding the stranger with polite curiosity. "Mama, who is this man?" "This is Mr. Caldwell, sweetheart. He's helping Mama with some important papers." Sarah smoothed Emma's hair, a gesture that had become automatic whenever she felt overwhelmed. "Why don't you show him how nicely you can write your name?" Emma dutifully displayed her slate, where Emma Rose McKinnon appeared in careful, slightly crooked letters. Caldwell examined it with the gravity of a judge, reviewing evidence. "Excellent penmanship, young lady. I suspect you'll be quite the scholar." He turned back to Sarah. "Stone has specifically requested that provision be made for the child's education. There's a good school in Cheyenne, or if you prefer, arrangements can be made for a private tutor." "School in Cheyenne?" Sarah's heart clenched. "That would mean boarding arrangements, yes, though only if that's your preference. Mr. Stone seemed to think you might want to keep the child close." Caldwell's tone suggested he found such sentimentality impractical but harmless. The idea of sending Emma away, even for her education, made Sarah's chest tight. She'd already lost too much. She wouldn't voluntarily lose more. After Caldwell departed, Sarah sat at the table studying the contract. The terms were generous, more generous than she dared hope. Jacob would pay off every debt, provide comfortable living conditions, and ask nothing in return that seemed unreasonable or improper. On paper, it looked like salvation. So why did she feel like she was signing away more than just her name? The question lingered as she prepared for the wedding, set for the following Saturday at the courthouse in Cheyenne. Jacob had suggested the simple ceremony to avoid the gossip and speculation that a church wedding might generate. "People will talk anyway," he'd said during one of his brief visits to finalize arrangements, "but let's give them as little to talk about as possible." He was right, of course. The news of their engagement had already set tongues wagging from Casper Creek to Sweetwater Station. Sarah McKinnon, the grieving widow, marrying the territory's most eligible bachelor after a courtship of exactly 1 week. The charitable assumed desperation had driven her to it. The less charitable whispered about indecent haste and suggested she'd been less faithful to Thomas's memory than appearances indicated. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had been particularly pointed in her observations. Such a sudden courtship, she'd mused while measuring out Sarah's flour. Though I suppose a woman in your position couldn't afford to be too particular about such things. Sarah had bitten back her response, paid for her purchases, and left without satisfying the woman's curiosity. But the words stung because they carried truth. She couldn't afford to be particular, couldn't afford the luxury of courtship and romance that other women took for granted. Emma, meanwhile, had embraced the idea of their upcoming marriage with the enthusiasm only a 6-year-old could muster. "Will Mr. Stone really be my new papa?" she asked for the 10th time as Sarah brushed her hair by lamplight. "Yes, sweetheart, he'll be your stepfather. But I can still remember my real papa, can't I? I can still talk about him." Sarah's hands stilled in Emma's dark curls. "Of course you can. Papa Thomas will always be your father, and you should never forget him. Mr. Stone understands that." "Good." Emma leaned back against her mother's chest with the boneless trust of childhood. "I think Papa Thomas would like Mr. Stone. They both have kind eyes." The observation surprised Sarah. She hadn't noticed Jacob's eyes particularly, beyond noting their color brown, like rich earth after rain. But Emma was right. There was kindness there, along with something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. Loneliness, perhaps, or a carefully controlled hope. The night before the wedding, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit pasture where Thomas's horses had once grazed. The land looked different in silver, light mysterious, full of possibilities instead of memories. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Jacob Stone, and this view would no longer be part of her daily life. Jacob had explained the living arrangements with characteristic directness. She and Emma would move to his ranch house, a substantial two-story structure with separate bedrooms for each of them and enough space for privacy. Her own ranch would be maintained by hired hands under Jacob's supervision, the profits such as they were deposited in an account bearing her name alone. "You can visit whenever you like," he'd assured her. "Consider it your retreat, your place to go when you need solitude or time to remember." The thoughtfulness of the gesture had surprised her. Most men would have seen the smaller ranch as a burden to be disposed of, not a sanctuary to be preserved. But then, Jacob Stone seemed to understand things about loss and memory that most people missed. When he'd mentioned Thomas, it wasn't with the awkward sympathy most people offered. It was with respect for what had been, acknowledgement that the past deserved honor, even as the future demanded attention. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Sarah dressed carefully in her best dress navy blue wool with modest lace trim, suitable for a widow remarrying without ostentation. Emma wore her Sunday dress, white with tiny blue flowers, and chatted excitedly about riding in Jacob's wagon to Cheyenne. He arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, driving a well-appointed buggy rather than the work wagon Sarah had expected. He wore a dark suit that showed his broad shoulders to advantage, and his hair was neatly trimmed, though it still showed the tendency to curl at the collar. "You look lovely," he said simply, helping her into the buggy with the same careful courtesy he'd shown from their first meeting. "Thank you." Sarah settled her skirts and tried to calm the flutter in her stomach. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. There was no reason for nervousness. But as they drove toward Cheyenne, with Emma bouncing excitedly between them and pointing out landmarks along the way, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing more than just miles of prairie. She was crossing into a new life, one where she would be known as Jacob Stone's wife, where her identity would be shaped by his reputation and their shared pretense of marital harmony. The courthouse ceremony was brief and businesslike, conducted by Judge Morrison with 2 clerks serving as witnesses. Sarah spoke her vows in a steady voice, Jacob's responses equally controlled. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob's kiss was gentle and brief, the touch of his lips against hers lasting barely a heartbeat. "Congratulations, Mrs. Stone," he said quietly, and Sarah felt a shock of recognition. She was no longer Sarah McKinnon. That woman Thomas's wife, the struggling widow wad, ceased to exist in the space between vow and kiss. Emma hugged them both with delighted enthusiasm, chattering about her new family as they signed the marriage certificate. To her, this was a celebration, the happy ending to a difficult chapter. Sarah envied her daughter's simple faith that everything would work out perfectly. On the ride back to Jacob's ranch, Sarah found herself studying her new husband's profile. He handled the reins with easy competence, answering Emma's endless questions with patience and good humor. When Emma asked about the horses she'd been promised, he described them in detail that made the child squirm with anticipation. "There's a gentle mare named Buttercup who's perfect for learning to ride," he told her, "and a colt named Thunder who's young enough to grow up with you. By the time you're 10, you'll be riding like you were born in the saddle." "Can Mama ride too?" Emma asked. She used to ride Papa Thomas's horses before they got sick. A shadow crossed Jacob's face at the mention of the horse's illness, another of Thomas's financial disasters that had contributed to their current situation. But he recovered smoothly. "Of course she can. We'll get her a horse of her own, something spirited enough to be interesting but gentle enough to be safe." Sarah listened to this conversation about her future with a strange sense of detachment. These people, her husband and daughter, were planning a life that included her, but she felt like an observer rather than a participant. As they approached Jacob's ranch, Sarah got her first clear look at what would be her new home. The house was larger than she'd expected, built of stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Corrals and outbuildings spread across the immediate area, all showing signs of prosperity and careful maintenance. This wasn't just a working ranch, it was an estate, the kind of establishment she'd never imagined inhabiting. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It's home," Jacob replied simply. "Our home now. Our home." The words carried weight, implied sharing and belonging that existed only on paper. As Jacob helped her down from the buggy, Sarah wondered how long it would take before the pretense began to feel real, and whether that would be a blessing or another kind of loss entirely. The stone ranch house possessed a grandeur that Sarah had only imagined from the outside. Inside, polished wood floors gleamed under hand-woven rugs, and furniture built to last generations filled rooms designed for comfortable living rather than mere survival. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by bookshelves that held more volumes than Sarah had seen outside of the general store. "This will be your room," Jacob said, leading her up the oak staircase to a spacious bedroom at the front of the house. Windows faced east toward the mountains, and someone had already placed a vase of late-season wildflowers on the dresser. "Emma's room is just next door, and mine is at the back of the house." The bed was larger than any Sarah had ever slept in, covered with a quilt in deep blues and greens that looked like it had been crafted by skilled hands. A writing desk sat beneath one window, complete with paper and Inca luxury she hadn't enjoyed since her teaching days back in Missouri. "It's lovely," Sarah said, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the dresser. "You didn't need to go to such trouble." "No trouble. A woman should have a comfortable place to call her own." Jacob's tone was matter-of-fact, but Sarah caught something else beneath it, perhaps the recognition that comfort had been scarce in her life lately. Emma's delighted shriek from the adjoining room interrupted any response Sarah might have made. They found the little girl bouncing on a bed that seemed enormous compared to the narrow cot she'd used at the old ranch, examining a collection of books that someone had thoughtfully arranged on a child-sized shelf. "Look, Mama, there are stories about princesses and horses and magic kingdoms." Emma held up a leather-bound volume with gilt lettering. "Can we read one tonight?" "Of course, sweetheart." Sarah glanced at Jacob, who was watching Emma's excitement with something approaching wonder. "Though perhaps we should thank Mr. Stone for providing such lovely books." "Thank you, Papa Jacob." Emma launched herself at her new stepfather with the fearless affection of childhood, wrapping her arms around his waist. Sarah watched Jacob's face transform as he returned the embrace, his expression softening in a way that made him look younger, less guarded. Whatever his motivations for this marriage, his fondness for Emma appeared genuine. The remainder of their first day passed in a careful dance of discovery and adjustment. Jacob showed them the kitchen larger and better equipped than anything Sarah had imagined, and explained that Mrs. Chen, his housekeeper, came 3 days a week to help with heavy cleaning and laundry. "She's been with me for 5 years. Jacob explained as Sarah examined the cast-iron stove that would make cooking infinitely easier than the temperamental wood-burning range she'd left behind. "Her husband works with the horses. Good people, very reliable." Sarah nodded, though privately she wondered how Mrs. Chen would react to suddenly having a woman of the house to answer to. In her experience, established households had their own rhythms, and newcomer 7 wives weren't always welcome disruptions. But Jacob seemed to anticipate her concerns. "I've explained the situation to both of them. They understand this is your home now, and they'll take direction from you regarding household matters." The phrase "the situation" hung in the air between them. Sarah wondered exactly how Jacob had explained their arrangement to his employees. A love match would require no explanation, but a marriage of convenience demanded delicate handling to maintain the fiction of normalcy. As afternoon faded toward evening, Jacob took them to see the horses Emma had been promised. The barn was a marvel of organization and cleanliness, with over a dozen animals in individual stalls that looked better maintained than some houses Sarah had known. Emma was immediately smitten with Buttercup, a gentle bay mare with kind eyes and infinite patience for small hands stroking her nose. Thunder, the young colt Jacob had mentioned, proved to be a spirited black yearling who pranced and nickered when Emma approached his stall. "He's beautiful," Emma breathed, her face glowing with the sort of pure joy Sarah hadn't seen since before Thomas died. "When can I ride him?" "Thunder needs another year or two before he's ready for riders," Jacob explained. "But Buttercup is perfect for learning. We can start your lessons tomorrow, if your mother agrees." Sarah found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. Emma's happiness felt fragile and precious, something to be protected and nurtured after too many months of worry and want. While Emma continued her exploration of the barn under Jacob's patient supervision, Sarah wandered to the far end where a workbench held various tools and leather goods in different stages of repair. Her attention was caught by something half hidden beneath a canvas top, the carved wooden horse that Thomas had been making for Emma before he died. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd searched everywhere for the toy after Thomas's death, knowing he'd been working on it, but unable to find where he'd hidden the surprise. Seeing it here, in Jacob's barn, raised questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. "You found it." Jacob's voice came from directly behind her, and Sarah realized she'd been staring at the wooden horse for several minutes. Where did you get this?" Jacob moved past her to lift the tarp completely, revealing not just the horse, but a small collection of Thomas's woodworking tools, carefully maintained and organized. "I bought them from the man who purchased your husband's effects after the funeral. I thought Emma should have her father's work." Sarah's vision blurred as she lifted the wooden horse, running her fingers over the smooth curves that Thomas's hands had shaped with such care. One leg had been broken and expertly repaired, the join nearly invisible, but for a slight difference in wood grain. "You fixed it," she whispered. "It needed finishing. The mane and tail weren't quite complete, and there was some damage from storage." Jacob's voice was gentle, careful. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty." "Mind?" Sarah clutched the wooden horse to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. This wasn't part of their business arrangement, wasn't something Jacob stood to gain from their marriage contract. This was pure kindness, the sort of consideration that came from understanding what mattered to a child who'd lost her father. "Emma should have this tonight," she managed to say. "I was hoping you'd think so." That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into her new bed, she presented the wooden horse with appropriate ceremony. Emma's joy was worth every tear Sarah had shed over the past 2 years, every sleepless night worrying about their future. "Papa Thomas made this for me." Emma held the horse reverently, examining every detail with the intensity children brought to treasured possessions. "He was working on it as a surprise for your birthday. Papa Jacob found it and made sure it was perfect for you." Emma looked toward the doorway where Jacob stood watching, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Thank you for fixing Papa Thomas's horse, Papa Jacob. I'll take very good care of it." "I know you will, little one." After Emma had fallen asleep clutching her wooden horse, Sarah found Jacob on the front porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. The night air carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking the chair beside his. "For the horse, for everything. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Jacob's interruption was firm but not unkind. "Emma deserves to have her father's love made tangible, and you deserve to see her happy." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who barely knew each other but were now bound by law and circumstance. Sarah found herself studying Jacob's profile in the moonlight, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands rested calmly on the arms of his chair. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course. Why haven't you married before now? A man in your position, with your successorly, you've had opportunities." Jacob was quiet. For so long, Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old disappointments. "I was engaged once, back in Kansas, before I came west. Margaret was a banker's daughter, beautiful, accomplished, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But when it came time to actually build a life together, she wanted me to give up ranching, move back east, become the sort of man who wore a suit to work and never got his hands dirty." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I realized I didn't want to spend my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. any more than she wanted to pretend the frontier suited her. So we ended it, and I came to Wyoming territory, determined to build something on my own terms. He glanced at Sarah. I suppose I've been gun-shy about romantic attachments ever since. And now I have a partnership based on honesty instead of illusion. We both know what we're getting into, what we can reasonably expect from each other. There's something to be said for that kind of clarity. Sarah nodded, though she wondered if clarity was always preferable to hope. Her marriage to Thomas had been built on dreams and passion, and while it had ended in heartbreak, she couldn't regret the love they'd shared. But perhaps this was better suited to where she was now, widow with a child to protect, a woman who'd learned that security mattered more than sentiment when it came to survival. As they prepared to retire for the evening, Jacob paused at the foot of the stairs. Sarah, Mrs. Stone, I want you to know that you're welcome to change anything about the house. Make it suit your preferences. This is your home now, not just a place you're staying. Thank you, Jacob. That means more than you know. Using his first name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way their carefully formal relationship wasn't meant to accommodate. But he'd called her Sarah, and something about the equality of it seemed important. Lying alone in the large, comfortable bed, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to process the strange turns her life had taken. This morning she'd been Sarah McKinnon, struggling widow. Tonight she was Mrs. Jacob Stone, mistress of a prosperous ranch, mother to a deliriously happy child. The transformation should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like stepping into someone else's life, wearing someone else's identity, like an ill-fitting dress. Tomorrow, she would have to learn how to be Jacob Stone's wife in public, how to present the united front their marriage contract required. But tonight, listening to Emma's peaceful breathing through the adjoining wall and the distant sound of Jacob moving quietly around his own room, Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps this strange arrangement might grow into something approaching contentment. It wasn't love, but after everything she'd lost, contentment seemed like enough. 3 weeks into their marriage, Sarah began to understand the rhythm of life at the Stone Ranch. Jacob rose before dawn to check the cattle and horses, returning for breakfast that she had learned to time precisely to his needs. Emma chattered through meals, regaling them with stories from her riding lessons and discoveries around the ranch. In the evenings, Jacob often worked at his desk, while Sarah mended clothes or read to Emma, the three of them existing in the same space, with the careful politeness of strangers sharing a railroad car. It was during one such evening that Sarah discovered her mother's recipe book among her possessions, its pages yellow with age and marked with stains from countless meals prepared with love and hope. She'd brought it from the old ranch without really thinking, one of the few personal items she'd been able to pack quickly. "What's that you're reading?" Jacob asked, looking up from his ledgers as Sarah turned the fragile pages by lamplight. "My mother's recipes. She wrote down everything she knew about cooking and keeping house, said a woman needed to know how to make a home wherever she found herself." Sarah's fingers traced her mother's careful handwriting instructions for cornbread that rose light as air, remedies for winter ailments, the secret to preserving vegetables through lean seasons. Jacob set aside his pen, genuine interest replacing the polite inquiry she'd expected. "My mother never wrote down her recipes. I always regretted that after she passed. There were certain dishes she made that no one else could duplicate." "What kind of dishes?" "Apple dumplings that seemed to float in their syrup, chicken and dumplings that could cure any ailment known to man. And bread, Lord, she could make bread that spoiled you for anything you could buy in town." Jacob's expression grew distant with memory. "I haven't tasted anything like it since she died." Something in his tone made Sarah look up from the recipe book, seeing past his usual careful composure to the loneliness beneath. Here was a man who owned thousands of acres, who commanded respect throughout the territory, but who missed his mother's cooking with the wistfulness of a lost child. "I could try to make some of those things," Sarah offered quietly. "If you'd like, Mama's book has recipes for all kinds of bread, and I've always been fair hand at dumplings." Jacob's smile transformed his entire face, reminding Sarah that he was still a relatively young man despite his serious demeanor. "I'd like that very much. Though I should warn you, my memories might be better than reality. Everything tastes better when you're 8 years old, and your biggest worry is finishing your chores before dark." "Maybe, but there's only one way to find out." So began a new routine. After Emma was tucked into bed each night, Sarah would sit at the kitchen table with her mother's recipe book, while Jacob told her about his childhood in Kansas, about his mother's cooking, and his father's determination to make something of their hard-scrabble farm. In return, Sarah shared memories of her own mother, of learning to cook on a temperamental wood stove, and the satisfaction of feeding a family well on very little. These conversations revealed sides of Jacob that Sarah hadn't expected. Away from the responsibilities of running the ranch, he proved to have a gentle sense of humor and a storyteller's gift for bringing the past to life. He spoke of his parents with deep affection, of siblings scattered to the winds by circumstance and ambition, of the loneliness that had driven him west in search of something he couldn't quite name. "I used to think success meant being able to do everything yourself," he admitted one evening, as Sarah practiced kneading dough the way her mother had taught her. "But there's something to be said for sharing the work, sharing the results." Sarah glanced up from her work, flour dusting her hands and probably smudged on her cheek. "Is that what we're doing? Sharing?" The question hung between them, heavier than she'd intended. They were sharing a house, sharing meals, sharing the responsibility of raising Emma. But sharing implied a partnership that went beyond their carefully negotiated contract. "I think so," Jacob said finally, "or learning how to anyway." The bread Sarah made that night was her mother's recipe for Sunday loaves rich with eggs and butter, sweetened with honey from the ranch's own hives. When Jacob tasted it the next morning, his eyes closed in something approaching reverence. "Not quite like my mother's," he said thoughtfully, "but better than I dared hope. Thank you." Such a simple exchange, bread offered and gratefully received, but something shifted between them in that moment. The careful distance they'd maintained began to soften around the edges, replaced by something warmer and more comfortable. Emma noticed the change, of course. Children had radar for adult emotions, especially when those emotions affected their own security. She began including Jacob more naturally in her conversations, asking his opinion on important matters like whether her wooden horse needed a name and what color ribbon would look best in Buttercup's mane. "Papa Jacob," she announced one morning over breakfast, using the title she'd assigned him with the confidence of childhood. "I think you should teach Mama how to ride better. She's scared of the big horses." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "I'm not scared, sweetheart. I'm just cautious." "She's being sensible," Jacob said diplomatically. "Some of our horses are quite spirited, but there's a gentle gelding named Steady who might suit you if you're interested in riding again." The truth was, Sarah missed riding more than she'd admitted. Before Thomas's illness, before the financial pressures mounted, she'd loved the freedom of moving across the prairie on horseback, the sense of partnership between rider and animal. But the horses at their old ranch had been sold off one by one, and she'd pushed the longing aside as just another loss to be endured. "I might like that," she said carefully. "Wonderful," Emma bounced in her chair. "We can ride together, all three of us, like a real family." The phrase "real family" echoed in Sarah's mind long after breakfast was finished. Was that what they were becoming? The marriage contract made no provision for genuine affection, yet she found herself looking forward to Jacob's return each evening, to the quiet conversations that had become part of their routine. More telling, she'd begun to think of the ranch house as home, rather than simply the place where she lived. She'd rearranged furniture to better suit their daily needs, added touches from her mother's house that made the rooms feel more personal. Jacob not only accepted these changes but encouraged them, seeming to understand that a woman needed to put her own stamp on her living space. The riding lessons began the following week. Steady proved to be aptly named a calm, patient gelding who tolerated Sarah's nervousness with the dignity of a horse who'd seen many beginners through their early fears. Jacob was a good teacher, patient and encouraging without being condescending. "Feel his rhythm," Jacob instructed as Sarah guided steady around the corral at a walk. "Don't fight against it. Let yourself move with him." Gradually, Sarah's confidence returned. The feel of a good horse beneath her, the familiar partnership of rider and mount, brought back memories of happier times when the future had seemed full of possibilities rather than limitations. Watching from the fence rail, Emma cheered every small victory, Sarah's first successful trot, the moment she stopped gripping the reins like a lifeline. The afternoon, she finally relaxed enough to enjoy the ride rather than simply endure it. "You're a natural," Jacob said as Sarah dismounted after a particularly successful lesson. "Thomas was right to be proud of your horsemanship." The mention of her late husband no longer brought the sharp stab of pain it once had. Instead, Sarah felt a gentle melancholy, like the ache of an old injury on a cold day present, but bearable. "He used to say I rode like I was born to it," she said, patting Steady's neck gratefully. "I'd forgotten how much I loved it." "Some things are worth remembering," Jacob replied quietly. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Emma play with her wooden horse in the yard, Sarah found herself studying Jacob's profile in the lamplight that spilled through the windows. He'd removed his hat, and his dark hair showed the imprint of long days working in sun and wind. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, bore the calluses of honest work. But they were gentle hands. She'd seen how carefully he handled the horses, how tenderly he'd repaired Emma's wooden toy. "Jacob," she said suddenly, "can I ask you something personal?" He turned to look at her, eyebrows raised in mild curiosity. "Of course. Do you ever regret this arrangement? The marriage, I mean, taking on the responsibility of Emma and me?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer with the same care he brought to all important matters. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. Do you?" Sarah looked out at Emma, who was galloping her wooden horse around an imaginary corral, complete with sound effects and encouragement for her mount. The child was thriving, healthier, happier, more secure than she'd been since Thomas's death. That alone made any sacrifice worthwhile. But it wasn't just Emma's welfare that had improved. Sarah herself felt more settled, more hopeful about the future than she had in months. The constant worry about money had lifted, replaced by the comfortable certainty of security. More than that, she'd rediscovered parts of herself that grief and struggle had buried. The woman who enjoyed cooking, who loved horses, who could find pleasure in simple domestic contentments. "No," she said honestly, "I don't regret it either." "Good." Jacob's smile was warm in the gathering dusk. "Because I think we're doing all right together, the three of us." As if summoned by his words, Emma ran up to the porch, wooden horse clutched in her hand and grass stains on her dress. "Can we have apple dumplings for dessert tomorrow?" she asked breathlessly. "I told Thunder about them, and I think he'd like to try one." "Horses don't eat apple dumplings, sweetheart," Sarah laughed. "How do you know? Have you ever asked one?" Jacob chuckled, reaching over to ruffle Emma's hair. "She has a point. We might have to test that theory." Watching them together, her daughter, and this man who'd become her husband in name, but was growing into something more like a true father, Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening air. This wasn't the passionate love she'd shared with Thomas, but it was something equally valuable: partnership, companionship, the quiet satisfaction of building something good together. As they prepared for bed that night, moving through the house with the easy familiarity of people who'd found their rhythm together, Sarah realized that contentment might be underrated. It lacked the drama of grand passion, but it wore well over time, comfortable as an old quilt and just as warming. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps, for a woman who'd already known great love and great loss, contentment was not a consolation prize, but a gift in its own right. The storm came without warning on a Tuesday evening in late October, rolling across the prairie like God's own fury unleashed upon the earth. Sarah had been preparing supper when the wind began howling around the house with a sound like banshees rattling windows and sending Emma running to her side with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama, what's that noise?" Before Sarah could answer, Jacob burst through the front door, his coat streaming water and his face grim with concern. "Storm cellar," he said without preamble. "Now, this one's going to be bad." Sarah had noticed the storm cellar during her first tour of the rancho, sturdy structure built into the hillside behind the house, designed to withstand the worst weather the territory could deliver. She'd hoped never to need it, but the increasing violence of the wind and the ominous green tinge to the sky suggested that hope had been naive. They gathered essential supplies, quickly blankets, water, the medical kit Jacob kept stocked for emergencies. Emma clutched her wooden horse and pressed close to Sarah's side as they hurried across the yard, the wind so strong it threatened to knock them off their feet. The storm cellar was larger than Sarah had expected, with sturdy wooden shelves lined with preserved food and emergency supplies. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on stone walls, and thick wooden beams overhead spoke of construction meant to last. Jacob lit several lamps, while Sarah settled Emma on a makeshift bed of blankets, trying to project calm she didn't feel. The storm hit with the force of a freight train. Through the thick walls, they could hear wind that sounded like the world ending, punctuated by crashes that might have been trees falling or buildings collapsing. Emma whimpered and burrowed deeper into Sarah's arms, while Jacob checked and rechecked their supplies with the methodical precision of a man who'd weathered such storms before. "How long do these usually last?" Sarah asked during a brief lull in the wind. "Could be an hour, could be all night. No way to know until it passes." Jacob's voice was steady, reassuring. "But we're safe here. This cellar has weathered storms for 15 years without so much as a leak." As if to test his confidence, the wind picked up again, howling with renewed fury. Something heavy crashed against the celladora tree branch, perhaps, or debris torn from one of the outbuildings. Emma's grip on Sarah tightened. "Tell me a story, Mama," she whispered. "A happy story about princesses and horses." So Sarah told stories, her voice competing with the storm's rage as she wove tales of brave princesses and magical kingdoms where storms always ended in rainbows. Jacob listened too, his expression softening as he watched Emma's fear gradually give way to drowsy contentment. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the close confines of the cellar began to feel oppressive despite its solid protection. They shared water and hardtack from Jacob's emergency supplies, and Sarah found herself grateful for his foresight in stocking the shelter so thoroughly. "You've done this before," she observed during another brief lull. "More times than I care to count. Prairie storms can turn deadly without warning. A wise man prepares for the worst and hopes for the best." Jacob's tone was matter-of-fact, but Sarah heard the experience behind his words, the hard-won knowledge of a man who'd learned to read weather signs and respect nature's power. Emma had dozed off against Sarah's shoulder, exhausted by fear and the late hour. In the lamplight, her face looked younger, more vulnerable, reminding Sarah of how much this child depended on the adults in her life for safety and stability. "She trusts you," Jacob said quietly, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "She's had to learn to trust quickly. Her world changed so much when Thomas died." Sarah smoothed Emma's hair gently, careful not to wake her. "Children are remarkably adaptable, but sometimes I wonder what all this upheaval is doing to her. She seems happy, happier than when I first met her." Sarah considered this. It was true, Emma had blossomed in the security of the stone ranch, her natural exuberance returning as her world stabilized. But Sarah still worried about the deeper effects of so much change in such a short time. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked suddenly. "This arrangement of ours, is it fair to her, letting her believe we're a real family when it's all just pretense?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Is it pretense, Sarah? Because from where I sit, we're doing exactly what real families do, protecting each other, sharing responsibilities, caring about each other's welfare. The only difference is how we started." "But we don't." Sarah stopped herself before saying love each other, because the words felt both true and false at the same time. They didn't love each other the way married couples were supposed to, with passion and romance and grand declarations. But there was something between them now, something that felt like caring, like genuine partnership. "We don't what?" Jacob's voice was gentle, encouraging her to finish the thought. "We don't have what most married couples have, the emotional connection, the intimacy. We're more like business partners sharing the same house." "Are we?" Jacob shifted slightly in the lamplight, and Sarah could see his face more clearly. "Because I find myself thinking about you during the day, wondering if you're happy, if there's anything you need, if Emma is settling in well. I look forward to our evening conversations, to sharing meals together, to the small domestic contentments that make a house feel like a home. If that's not emotional connection, what is it?" Sarah felt her breath catch. She'd been thinking the same things, feeling the same gradual shift from polite coexistence to something warmer and more substantial. But hearing Jacob articulate it made it real in a way that frightened her. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think it's the beginning of something real," Jacob said quietly. "Not the passionate romance of storybooks, but something steadier, more durable, built on respect and growing affection rather than infatuation." The storm chose that moment to unleash another furious assault on their shelter, wind howling like a living thing, and rain drumming against the door with enough force to rattle the hinges. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms but didn't wake, trusting in the safety of the adults around her. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted suddenly, and she wasn't talking about the storm. "Of what?" "Of caring too much, of forgetting that this is supposed to be temporary, that we agreed it could end after a year if it didn't work out." She looked down at Emma's sleeping face. "Of her getting too attached and being hurt if things change." Jacob leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped between them. "Sarah, look at me." Reluctantly, she met his eyes. In the lamplight, they looked almost black, but warm with an intensity that made her heart skip. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "This arrangement, this marriage, it's not something I entered into lightly, and it's not something I plan to abandon when things get complicated. If you're worried about Emma getting attached, don't be. I'm already attached to her, and to you, more than I probably should be, according to our original agreement." "Jacob, let me finish." His voice was gentle but determined. "I know this wasn't what either of us planned. I know we both came into this thinking we could keep our hearts safely locked away, maintain proper emotional distance, but hearts don't always cooperate with practical arrangements, do they?" Sarah shook her head mutely, afraid to trust her voice. "So maybe it's time to admit that this has become more than a business deal. Maybe it's time to stop pretending we're just business partners and acknowledge that we're becoming something else. See, real family, built on different foundations than most, but real nonetheless." Thunder crashed overhead, so close and loud that the cellar seemed to shake. Emma stirred again, murmuring something in her sleep about horses and storms. Sarah held her closer, drawing comfort from the child's warm weight against her chest. "What are you saying?" she asked Jacob quietly. "I'm saying that I care about you, Sarah, more than I expected to, more than our contract requires. I'm saying that when you smile at something Emma's done, when you bring me coffee without being asked, when you share your mother's recipes and stories from your childhood, those moments matter to me. They make me happier than I've been in years." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I care about you too," she whispered. "That's what scares me." "Why does caring scare you?" "Because caring means being vulnerable. It means having something to lose again, and I'm not sure I could survive losing another person I love." There, she'd said it, the word that had been dancing around the edges of their conversation, the emotion she'd been so carefully avoiding, acknowledging, love, or at least the possibility of it. Jacob reached across the small space between them, his hand covering hers where it rested on Emma's back. His touch was warm, solid, reassuring. "Love always means risking loss," he said softly, "but the alternative is living half a life, keeping yourself so protected that you never really connect with anyone. Is that what you want for Emma?" For her to see her mother afraid to care, afraid to take chances on happiness. Sarah considered his words as the storm raged above them. Emma had already lost one father. What would it do to her to lose another if this arrangement fell apart? But conversely, what would it do to her to grow up in a house where the adults were afraid to be fully present with each other? "I don't know how to do this," Sarah admitted. "How to let myself care without being terrified of the consequences." "Neither do I," Jacob said honestly. "But maybe we can learn together. Maybe we can take it one day at a time, let whatever's growing between us develop naturally, instead of trying to force it or prevent it." The storm was beginning to weaken, the winds howled, diminishing to a more manageable roar. Soon they'd be able to leave the shelter, return to the house, resume their careful daily routines. But something had changed. In the intimate darkness of the storm cellar, some barrier had been acknowledged and gently set aside. "All right," Sarah said finally, "one day at a time." Jacob's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. One day at a time. When the storm finally passed and they emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, they found surprisingly little damage to the main buildings. A few tree branches down, some scattered debris, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up with a day's work. The house itself was untouched, as solid and welcoming as they'd left it hours earlier. Emma woke as they carried her upstairs to her bedroom, blinking sleepily in the lamplight. "Is the storm over, Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart. We're all safe." "Good." Emma's voice was already drowsy again. "I wasn't scared. Papa Jacob kept us safe." As Sarah tucked Emma into bed, she caught Jacob's eye across the child's small form. Something had indeed changed during their hours in the storm cellar, not just between the adults, but in Emma's perception of their family unit. She'd called Jacob Papa without hesitation, claimed his protection as her right, trusted in his ability to keep them safe. Perhaps Jacob was right. Perhaps they were already a real family, and it was time to stop pretending otherwise. Later, as they stood in the hallway outside their respective bedrooms, the careful distance they'd maintained for weeks seemed suddenly artificial. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for keeping us safe, for making me feel like caring isn't just another form of recklessness." "Thank you for letting me in," Jacob replied, "for trusting me with Emma, with yourself. I know that wasn't easy." They stood there for a moment longer, neither quite ready to retreat to the separate rooms that suddenly seemed less necessary than before. Finally, Sarah reached up and touched Jacob's cheek gently, a gesture of gratitude and something deeper. "Good night, Jacob." "Good night, Sarah." As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself humming something she hadn't done since Thomas died. The storm was over, her family was safe, and for the first time in months, the future felt full of possibilities rather than fears. Outside her window, the first light of dawn was painting the sky pale gold, promising a new day filled with whatever they chose to make of it. The photograph fell from between the pages of Jacob's ledger like an autumn leaf, fluttering to the floor at Sarah's feet as she tidied his desk. She'd been straightening the papers scattered by their hasty departure to the storm cellar the night before, a domestic task that had become second nature in the weeks since their marriage. But as she bent to retrieve the fallen photograph, her world tilted on its axis. Two young men stared back at her from the faded daguerreotype, unmistakably Jacob, though years younger, and with a carefree expression she'd never seen on his face. The other was Thomas. Her Thomas, grinning with the easy confidence of youth, his arms slung companionably around Jacob's shoulders. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the photograph more closely. Both men wore the uniforms of railroad workers, and scrawled across the bottom in fading ink were the words, "Kansas Pacific Railway, Summer 1868, J. Stone, T. McKinnon." "Sarah," Jacob's voice came from the doorway, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that confirmed her worst fears. He'd known this moment would come eventually. "You knew him." Her voice came out flat, emotionless. "You knew Thomas before you came to Wyoming, before he married me." Jacob stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with careful precision. "Yes." "How long?" Sarah's grip on the photograph tightened until her knuckles showed white. "How long have you known who I was when you made your proposition?" From the beginning, Jacob's honesty hit like a physical blow. "I knew exactly who you were when I rode up to your door that day." Sarah sank into the chair behind his desk, the photograph trembling in her hands. Everything she'd believed about their arrangement, about Jacob's motivations, crumbled like a house built on sand. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew how it would sound. I knew you'd think I was taking advantage of your situation, that my feelings weren't genuine." Jacob remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back like a soldier awaiting judgment. "I knew you'd refuse my help if you thought it was driven by pity or guilt." "Wasn't it?" Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of betrayal. "Pity for poor Thomas McKinnon's widow? Guilt because you had the success that eluded him?" "No." Jacob's answer was firm, but Sarah heard the hurt beneath it. "It was love, Sarah. It was love for a woman I'd admired from afar for years, love for the memory of the best friend I ever had, love for a child who deserved better than the hand fate had dealt her." Love. The word that had been growing between them, the emotion they'd begun to acknowledge in the storm cellar, now felt tainted by deception. How could she trust feelings built on a foundation of lies? "Tell me," she demanded. "Tell me everything. How you knew Thomas, how you knew about me, why you waited until now to—" She gestured helplessly at the photograph. Jacob moved to the window, looking out at the ranch he'd built with such care. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories and older regrets. "Thomas and I worked together on the Kansas Pacific for 3 years. We were young, full of dreams about making our fortunes and settling down with good women and better land. He talked about you constantly, the school teacher he was courting back in Missouri, the woman who wrote him letters that made him smile for days." Jacob's hands gripped the windowsill. "I was half in love with you before I ever met you, just from hearing Thomas describe your intelligence, your kindness, your strength." Sarah's throat tightened. She remembered those letters, remembered pouring her heart onto paper for a young man who seemed to treasure every word. "When Thomas decided to leave the railroad and try his hand at ranching, I wanted to go with him. We had plans partners in business, as we'd been partners in work. But then my father died, left me some money and the responsibility for my mother and sister. I had to go back to Kansas, settle affairs, make arrangements. By the time I was free to leave, Thomas had already bought his land and married you. So you came to Wyoming later. 2 years later, I bought land as close to Thomas's ranch as I could manage, thinking we could still be partners, still build something together." Jacob's voice grew heavy with regret. "But when I arrived, I found a man changed by responsibility and struggling with problems I couldn't solve for him." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering those early years of their marriage. Thomas's optimism gradually giving way to worry as one venture after another failed to yield the profits he'd expected. The weight of providing for a wife and then a child, the pressure of making dreams reality. "He was proud," Jacob continued, "too proud to accept help, too proud to admit that ranching wasn't coming as naturally to him as he'd hoped. I offered partnership, offered loans, offered to buy some of his stock when money got tight. He refused it all. He never mentioned you." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "In all our years together, he never once spoke of a friend named Jacob Stone. Because I reminded him of failure. Every time he saw me prospering while he struggled, it was a reflection of his own disappointments. We spoke at market days, maintained polite relations, but the friendship we'd shared was gone." Jacob turned from the window to face her. "The last time I saw him alive, he told me to stay away from his family, said he wouldn't have his wife and daughter watching him be diminished by comparison to his more successful friend." The revelation cut deep. Sarah could picture Thomas saying exactly those words, his pride wounded by circumstances beyond his control. She could understand his refusal of help, his determination to succeed or fail on his own terms. But she could also see how that pride had cost him the support that might have saved everything. "So when he died," she said slowly, "you knew exactly how desperate our situation was." "I knew Thomas had been struggling. I knew there were debts, knew the ranch was failing. But I didn't know how bad things had gotten until I heard talk at the bank, until I realized you were facing foreclosure. Jacob moved closer, his expression intense. That's when I knew I had to act, had to find a way to help that you wouldn't refuse out of hand. So, you proposed marriage. The words tasted bitter. A business arrangement that would let you salve your conscience while keeping me from knowing your real motives. My motives were exactly what I told you. I needed a wife. You needed security. The fact that I'd loved you from afar for years, that I'd grieved for Thomas and wanted to honor his memory by protecting his family, those were reasons I couldn't share, without sounding like either a madman or a liar. Sarah stared at the photograph again, seeing her husband's young, hopeful face beside Jacob's. Two friends who'd let pride and circumstance destroy their bond, leaving her caught in the aftermath of their fractured relationship. You should have told me, she said finally. You should have trusted me with the truth instead of building our marriage on deception. Would you have accepted my proposal if you'd known? Would you have believed that my feelings were genuine rather than obligation to a dead friend's memory? The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah searched her heart for honesty and found it painful. No, she probably wouldn't have accepted. She would have seen his offer as charity, as pity disguised as partnership. Her pride, the same pride that had crippled Thomas, would have made her refuse. That's not the point, she said, though they both knew it was exactly the point. The point is that you made that choice for me. You decided what I could and couldn't handle, what I needed to know or not know. That's not partnership, Jacob. That's manipulation. Jacob flinched as if she'd struck him. You're right. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. I was a coward, afraid that honesty would cost me the chance to have you in my life. And now, Sarah stood, the photograph clutched in her hand like evidence of betrayal. What happens now that I know? Now that I understand this whole marriage was built on your guilt and my ignorance. Now you decide whether what we've built together matters more than how it started. Jacob's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. You decide whether the feelings that have grown between us are real enough to survive the truth about their origins. Sarah looked around the room that had become familiar, comfortable, home. 3 weeks ago, she would have said their arrangement was purely practical, that whatever affection existed between them was mild and easily severed. But the storm cellar had changed things. Their conversations over her mother's recipes had changed things. The gradual building of trust and companionship had changed things. Or had it? How could she trust any of her feelings now, knowing they'd been cultivated through deception? I need time, she said quietly. I need to think about all of this, about what it means. Of course. Jacob's acceptance was immediate, though it clearly cost him. Take all the time you need. But Sarah, he paused, seeming to gather himself. Whatever you decide about us, about our marriage, Emma's security doesn't have to depend on it. I meant what I said about the legal arrangements. This ranch, the money, the provisions for her future, they're hers, regardless of what happens between you and me. It was exactly what she would have expected him to say, and somehow that made it worse. His honor, his decency, his careful consideration of her needs, were they genuine, or were they products of guilt and obligation? I'll be at my old ranch for a few days, Sarah said, moving toward the door. I need space to think, away from all this. What do I tell Emma? Sarah paused, her hand on the doorknob. Emma, who'd been so happy, so secure in their new family arrangement. Emma, who called Jacob Papa with such trust and affection. Tell her I need to check on the old place, make sure everything's secure after the storm. Tell her I'll be back soon. Sarah's voice caught. Don't tell her anything else. Not yet. As she packed a small bag, Sarah tried to sort through the tangle of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger at Jacob's deception, hurt at being manipulated, confusion about whether her feelings were real or manufactured. But underneath it all was a deeper pain, the realization that she'd been falling in love with a man who might not exist, whose kindness and patience might be nothing more than elaborate penance for failing a friend. The ride to her old ranch gave her time to think, to process the magnitude of Jacob's revelation. The small house looked exactly as she'd left it, preserved by Jacob's care and attention. As she built a fire in the cold fireplace and made herself tea from supplies Jacob had thoughtfully maintained, Sarah realized that even his care of this place now seemed suspect. Was it kindness or was it guilt? That evening, sitting alone in the house where she'd been Thomas's wife, Sarah allowed herself to grieve not just for her husband, but for the trust that had been shattered, for the future that had suddenly become uncertain again. She'd thought she was building something real with Jacob, something that honored Thomas's memory while creating new possibilities. Instead, she discovered she was living in the shadow of a friendship destroyed by pride and silence, a marriage founded on secrets and manipulation. How could she ever trust Jacob again? How could she trust her own feelings, knowing they'd been shaped by carefully orchestrated deception? But as the night deepened and memories of recent weeks filled her mind, Jacob's patience with Emma, his consideration for her own needs, the growing warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, Sarah found herself wondering if the source of their relationship mattered as much as what it had become. Love born of guilt was still love, wasn't it? Kindness motivated by obligation was still kindness. The man who'd held her through the storm, who'd shared his memories and dreams, who'd made her feel safe and valued again, was that man less real because his initial approach had been less than honest? By morning, Sarah was no closer to answers. But she knew she had to face Jacob again, had to confront the truth about their marriage and decide what, if anything, could be salvaged from the wreckage of her shattered trust. Sarah spent 3 days at the old ranch. 3 days of solitude interrupted only by the wind across the prairie and her own restless thoughts. She walked the familiar paths, sat in Thomas's chair by the window, and tried to separate truth from deception in the tangle of emotions that Jacob's revelation had created. On the morning of the 4th day, she found Emma waiting on the front porch when she opened the door to gather firewood. "Mama!" Emma launched herself from the porch steps into Sarah's arms with the desperate enthusiasm of a child who'd been abandoned by half her world. "You've been gone forever. Papa Jacob said you needed to check on the old house, but I think you were sad about something." Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling the solid reality of Emma's small body against her chest. Here, at least, was something pure and uncomplicated, a child's love, given freely and without condition. "I missed you too, sweetheart. How did you get here?" "Papa, Jacob brought me. He's waiting by the gate." Emma pulled back to look at Sarah's face with the serious expression she wore when trying to solve adult mysteries. "Are you still sad, Mama?" Before Sarah could answer, Jacob's voice carried across the yard. "Emma, you were supposed to wait for me." He approached slowly, hat in hand, looking uncertain in a way that reminded Sarah of their first meeting. But now she knew that uncertainty was carefully calculated, that every gesture was weighted with knowledge he'd kept hidden. "I needed to see that you were all right," he said simply. Emma was worried. We both were. "I'm fine." Sarah's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw Emma's eyes widen with confusion. Children had radar for adult tensions, especially when those tensions threatened their security. "Can we go home now?" Emma asked, looking between her parents with the fragile hope of a child trying to hold her world together through sheer will. "I want to show you how well I can ride Buttercup now. Papa Jacob says I'm almost ready to try riding Thunder." Home. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. Where was home now? The old ranch where she'd been Thomas's wife, or the new one where she'd been learning to be Jacob's? The place where she'd known who she was, or the place where she'd discovered that identity might be built on lies? "In a minute, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "Papa, Jacob and I need to talk first. Why don't you go see if there are any apples left on the tree behind the house?" Emma departed reluctantly, clearly preferring to keep both parents in sight rather than risk another disappearance. Once she was out of earshot, Sarah turned to face Jacob fully for the first time since discovering the photograph. "She's been asking for you every day, Jacob said quietly, wanting to know when you're coming home, whether she did something wrong to make you leave. Guilt twisted in Sarah's chest. In her need to process Jacob's betrayal, she'd forgotten that Emma might interpret her absence as abandonment. The child had already lost one parent. How could Sarah have risked making her feel abandoned by another? "I needed time to think," Sarah said defensively. "I understand that, but Emma doesn't. She just knows that her mother disappeared without explanation, and she's terrified it might happen again." The accusation stung because it was true. Sarah had been so focused on her own hurt that she'd failed to consider Emma's needs, just as Jacob had failed to consider Sarah's right to the truth. "I never meant to frighten her." "I know, just like I never meant to deceive you." Jacob's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the strain around his eyes, the careful control he was maintaining. But intentions don't always prevent harm, do they? They stood in awkward silence, two people who'd been learning to trust each other, now separated by walls of hurt and suspicion. In the distance, Emma's voice drifted back to them as she talked to the apple tree, carrying on the sort of one-sided conversation that children used to make sense of confusing adult behavior. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah began slowly. "About Thomas, about your friendship, about why you didn't tell me the truth." Jacob waited, making no attempt to influence her words or rush her conclusions. "I understand why you kept silent. I even understand why Thomas asked you to stay away. Pride is a terrible thing sometimes. It makes us refuse help when we need it most, makes us push away the people who care about us." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she found her footing. "But understanding doesn't make it right, Jacob. You should have trusted me with the truth." "You're absolutely right. I was a coward, and my cowardice hurt you. I'm sorry, Sarah. More sorry than you can know." His apology was everything she'd wanted to hear, but it didn't magically heal the wound his deception had created. Trust, once broken, required more than words to repair. "The question now," Sarah continued, "is whether we can build something honest from what we have, whether the feelings that have grown between us are strong enough to survive the truth about how they started." Jacob stepped closer, hope flickering in his eyes. "What do you think? Can we?" Sarah looked past him to where Emma was now sitting beneath the apple tree, probably telling her wooden horse about her worries and fears. The child deserved stability, deserved parents who could work through their problems without destroying her sense of security. But more than that, Sarah realized she'd been happier in the past few weeks than she'd been since Thomas died. Despite the deception, despite the complicated motivations, Jacob had given her and Emma a good life. He'd been patient, kind, genuinely caring in ways that couldn't be entirely fabricated. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that we need to start over. Not the marriage that's legal and binding and affects Emma's future, but the relationship beneath it. We need to begin again, with honesty this time." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" Sarah had been considering this question for 3 days, weighing options and possibilities. "It means we go back to the beginning. We court each other properly, with full knowledge of who we are and what we've been to each other. It means you earn my trust instead of assuming it, and I learn to trust again instead of hiding behind walls." Jacob's face transformed with something that looked like wonder. "You're willing to try? Even after everything?" "I'm willing to try because of everything," Sarah corrected. "Because you saved us when we needed saving, because you've been good to Emma, because even your deception came from caring rather than cruelty. But mostly because I think what we've built together is worth fighting for if we can build it on truth this time." "And the sleeping arrangements, the separate bedrooms?" Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "Those stay as they are until we're sure. Until we both know that what we feel is real and lasting, not just gratitude and guilt, dressed up as something more." Jacob nodded, though Sarah could see the effort it cost him. "Whatever you need, however long it takes, I'll wait. Even if I decide it won't work, even if I conclude that the deception was too great a breach of trust to overcome." The question hung between them like a sword, and Sarah watched Jacob consider its implications. If she ultimately rejected him, he'd have given up his chance at the marriage he'd wanted, spent months or years courting a woman who might never be able to love him fully. Even then, he said firmly, because you deserve the choice, Sarah. You deserve to know who I really am and decide for yourself whether that's someone you can build a life with. Emma came running back from the apple tree, her face bright with the particular joy children showed when they sensed their world was stabilizing again. Are we going home now, all of us together? Sarah looked at Jacob, seeing past the careful composure to the man beneath flawed, complicated, but fundamentally decent. A man who'd made mistakes but was willing to face the consequences, willing to fight for what mattered to him. Yes, sweetheart, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. We're going home, all of us together. But as they gathered Sarah's few belongings and prepared for the ride back to the stone ranch, she knew the real work was just beginning. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt piece by piece, day by day, through small acts of honesty and care. Love, if it was to survive, had to be tested and proven, rather than simply assumed. The ride back passed in companionable silence, broken only by Emma's chatter about everything that had happened during Sarah's absence. Jacob had let her help with the horses, had taught her to identify different birds by their calls, had read to her from the books in Sarah's room when she'd been too homesick to sleep. "He missed you too, Mama," Emma confided as they neared the ranch house. "I could tell because he kept looking at your chair during dinner like he was waiting for you to sit in it." Sarah glanced at Jacob, who was carefully focused on the road ahead, and felt something loosen in her chest. Perhaps the feelings between them were more real than she'd allowed herself to believe. Perhaps honesty, painful as it was, might actually strengthen rather than destroy what they'd built. That evening, as they sat on the porch after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah found herself studying Jacob's face in the lamplight. Without the barrier of deception between them, she could see him more clearly, the lines around his eyes that spoke of worry during her absence, the careful way he held himself as if afraid to assume too much. "This won't be easy," she said quietly. "Learning to trust again, building something real from such complicated beginnings." "Nothing worthwhile ever is easy," Jacob replied, "but I think we have something worth the effort, don't you?" Sarah looked out at the land that was becoming familiar, at the home that was becoming theirs, at the life they were slowly, carefully constructing together. It wasn't the passionate romance of her youth, but it was something potentially deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the kind of love that grew stronger through adversity rather than weaker. "Yes," she said finally, "I think we do." As they prepared to retire for the evening, moving through the house with the careful courtesy of people learning to trust again, Sarah felt the weight of decision settling over her. She'd chosen to fight for their marriage, to believe in the possibility of real love growing from complicated beginnings. Now came the harder task, proving to herself and to Jacob that some things were worth the risk of hoping for, worth the vulnerability of opening a heart that had already known too much loss. Time would tell whether their foundation was strong enough to support the weight of truth, whether love built on honesty could grow deep enough to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. But for the first time since discovering that photograph, Sarah felt genuinely hopeful about the answer. The conversation that would define their future began 3 weeks later, on a crisp November evening when Emma had finally fallen asleep after an hour of excited chatter about the Thanksgiving celebration the community was planning. Sarah found Jacob on the front porch, as had become their custom. But tonight, the careful distance they'd maintained since her return felt artificial and strained. "We need to talk," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside his. "Really talk about everything we've been dancing around since I came back." Jacob set aside the ledger he'd been reviewing and gave her his full attention. In the weeks since her return, he'd been scrupulously careful not to push, not to assume anything about their relationship's direction. But Sarah could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of uncertainty he'd been carrying. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah continued, "about starting over with honesty, about whether what we have is worth fighting for. And what have you concluded?" Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her courage for the words that would either heal their marriage or end it. I've concluded that I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of letting fear make my decisions. Tired of protecting myself so carefully that I forget how to really live. Jacob remained silent, waiting for her to find her way to whatever truth she needed to share. For 2 years after Thomas died, I told myself that loving once was enough, that I couldn't risk my heart again. Then you came along with your practical proposal, and I thought I'd found the perfect solution: security, without vulnerability, companionship, without the risk of real intimacy. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she found her footing, but feelings don't cooperate with practical arrangements, do they? Somewhere between your kindness to Emma and your patience with me, between shared meals and quiet conversations, I started caring about you in ways our contract never anticipated. Sarah, let me finish, she said gently. When I discovered that photograph, when I learned about your friendship with Thomas, I felt betrayed. Not just because you'd deceived me, but because it called everything into question. Were your feelings real, or were they guilt dressed up as affection? Was I falling in love with you, or with some idealized version you'd created to ease your conscience? Jacob's hands clenched on the arms of his chair, but he remained silent. I spent 3 days at the old ranch trying to sort truth from deception, trying to decide whether your hidden motives invalidated everything we'd built together. And you know what I realized? What? I realized that motivations matter less than actions, that a man who saves a woman and child from destitution, who treats them with kindness and respect, who provides security and affection, that man's reasons for doing so are less important than the fact that he does them at all. Sarah turned in her chair to face Jacob fully, seeing the hope that was beginning to kindle in his eyes. More than that, I realized that love isn't diminished by complicated beginnings. Thomas and I loved each other desperately, purely, without any hidden agendas or complex histories. But that love, beautiful as it was, couldn't survive the pressures of real life. It burned bright and fast and left me with wonderful memories and impossible debts. And what we have is different. It's built on understanding, on shared responsibility, on the kind of partnership that gets stronger under pressure rather than weaker. It's not the passionate romance of my youth, but it's something potentially deeper, more durable, more real. Jacob leaned forward, his voice carefully controlled. Are you saying you've forgiven me for not telling you about Thomas? I'm saying I understand why you didn't tell me, and I'm choosing to focus on what you've done rather than what you failed to do. Sarah's voice grew firmer with conviction. You saved us, Jacob. You gave Emma security and me hope when I thought both were lost forever. You've been patient and kind and honorable in ways that go far beyond obligation to a dead friend's memory. But Sarah smiled at his perceptiveness. But I need to know that what's growing between us is real. Not gratitude masquerading as love, not guilt-seeking absolution, but genuine affection between two people who choose to be together. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute honesty. Sarah, I need you to understand something. My feelings for you began long before I ever met you, fed by Thomas's stories and letters he'd share when he was feeling particularly homesick. But they became real, became mine, rather than borrowed admiration, the first time I saw you at his funeral. Sarah's breath caught. She barely remembered that day, lost as she'd been in grief and shock. You stood by his grave with such dignity, such strength, even though I could see you were breaking apart inside. You held Emma close and spoke the words of farewell with a grace that took my breath away. That's when I knew that Thomas's stories hadn't done you justice, that you were even more remarkable than he'd described. Jacob's voice grew softer, more intimate. What I feel for you now has nothing to do with Thomas, nothing to do with guilt or obligation. It's about the woman who shares her mother's recipes and stories from her childhood. It's about watching you with Emma, seeing the fierce love and protective instincts that make you such an extraordinary mother. It's about your strength and your vulnerability, your kindness and your intelligence, your capacity for joy despite everything you've endured. He reached across the space between their chairs, his hand covering hers with gentle certainty. "I love you, Sarah. Not Thomas's wife, not the woman he described in his letters, but you, the person you are right now, in this moment, with all your fears and hopes and dreams. I love the way you hum when you're cooking, the way you read to Emma with different voices for each character, the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating on something difficult." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the specificity of his observations, the clear evidence that he really saw her as an individual, rather than as a memory or obligation. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I think I have for weeks, but I was too afraid to acknowledge it, too afraid of being hurt again." Jacob's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "And now, are you still afraid?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted with a shaky laugh. "But I'm more afraid of living half a life, of letting fear rob us of whatever happiness we might build together." Jacob lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "So where does that leave us? What happens now?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the practical implications of their emotional breakthrough. They were legally married, but had been living as polite strangers sharing a house. Now they were acknowledging love, but still maintaining the careful boundaries they'd established at the beginning. "Now we become what we should have been from the start," she said firmly. "Real partners, real spouses, building a real marriage based on honesty and mutual affection." "And the separate bedrooms?" Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "I think separate bedrooms might be counterproductive to building real intimacy, don't you?" Jacob's intake of breath was audible. "Sarah, are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured." "I'm sure." Her voice was steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'm sure because I trust you, because I love you, and because I want our marriage to be real in every way that matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of their decision settling between them. They were crossing a threshold, moving from the careful pretense of their arrangement into the uncertain but hopeful territory of genuine marriage. "There's something I want to give you," Jacob said suddenly, rising from his chair. "Something I should have given you weeks ago." He disappeared into the house, returning with a small wooden box that Sarah recognized as the one that usually sat on his dresser. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, was a simple gold band knot, ornate or expensive, but beautiful in its understated elegance. "This was my grandmother's wedding ring," Jacob said, lifting the band from its resting place. "I bought you a ring for our wedding, but it was just jewelry, nothing with meaning or history. This is different. This is what I want you to wear as my wife, if you're willing." Sarah looked down at her left hand, where Thomas's ring still rested on her finger. She'd worn it every day since his death, unable to imagine removing it, unable to let go of that tangible connection to their love. "I can't take off Thomas's ring," she said quietly. "I'm not ready for that yet." "I'm not asking you to," Jacob replied, surprising her. "Thomas was your first love, Emma's father, a good man who deserves to be remembered. Wear his ring on your right hand. Wear it always if you want to. But wear mine on your left hand as a symbol of our future rather than our past." The solution was so simple, so respectful of both her history and their present, that Sarah felt tears well up again. Carefully, reverently, she moved Thomas's ring to her right hand, where it caught the lamplight like a blessing rather than a burden. Jacob slipped his grandmother's ring onto her left hand, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. The gesture felt like a benediction, a formal acknowledgement of what they'd both finally found the courage to claim. "Mrs. Stone," Jacob said softly, lifting her hand to his lips once more. "Mr. Stone," Sarah replied, and for the first time the name felt completely, authentically hers. That night, as they stood together in the hallway outside their bedrooms, the familiar geography of the house felt transformed by their new understanding. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite boundaries that had defined their coexistence, no longer seemed necessary or desirable. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying a question he was too much of a gentleman to voice directly. She answered by taking his hand, leading him toward what had been her room, but would now be theirs. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded her of her wedding night with Thomas, but this was different. This was a choice made with full knowledge, full acceptance of who they were and what they meant to each other. Inside the room, lamplight cast dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed her solitude, her struggles, her gradual healing. Now they would witness something new, tentative beginning of a love that had grown slowly, carefully, from practical beginnings to something profound and lasting. Jacob closed the door behind them with gentle finality, then turned to face her. In the soft light, his face showed all the tenderness she'd glimpsed in unguarded moments, all the patient devotion he'd shown her and Emma over the weeks of their strange courtship. "Are you certain?" he asked, though his eyes told her he already knew the answer. "I'm certain," Sarah replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. What followed was tender and careful, two people learning each other with the reverence of those who understood that love was precious and fragile, not to be rushed or taken for granted. Jacob's hands were gentle as they mapped the curves of her face, the line of her neck, the places where worry and grief had left their marks. Sarah found herself marveling at his patience, his consideration, the way he made her feel cherished rather than simply desired. When she woke the next morning in his arms, sunlight streaming through windows that no longer seemed to frame a solitary woman's view, but a shared life's perspective, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death-complete peace. Not the careful contentment she'd been cultivating, but actual peace, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. "Good morning, wife," Jacob murmured against her hair, his voice rough with sleep and contentment. "Good morning, husband," she replied, and the word felt natural in a way it never had before. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch awakening around them. Cattle lowing in the distance, birds beginning their morning songs, the familiar creak of the house settling into another day. But there was a new sound too, Emma's bare feet pattering down the hallway, probably looking for her parents. "Mama, Papa Jacob?" Emma's voice came through the door, followed by a tentative knock. "Are you awake? Mrs. Chen is here, and she wants to know if you want biscuits or flapjacks for breakfast." Sarah and Jacob looked at each other and burst into quiet laughter. Real life, with all its domestic demands and childhood interruptions, was reasserting itself. But instead of feeling intrusive, it felt perfect, a reminder that love wasn't just about stolen moments of intimacy, but about building a life together, creating a family that could encompass all the mundane joys and challenges of everyday existence. "Flapjacks, sweetheart," Sarah called out. "We'll be down in a few minutes." "All right." Emma's footsteps retreated with the satisfaction of someone whose world was operating exactly as it should. Over breakfast, Emma chatted about her plans for the day-riding lessons with Jacob, helping Sarah with the mending, showing Thunder how much she'd grown since their last conversation. Her innocent acceptance of her parents' obvious happiness, the way she took their togetherness for granted, reinforced Sarah's conviction that they'd made the right choice. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who'd become a trusted part of their household routine, noticed the change immediately. She said nothing directly, but Sarah caught her small smile of approval as she served the meal, saw the way her shoulders relaxed, as if some tension she'd been carrying had finally eased. "The family is complete now," Mrs. Chen said quietly to Sarah as they cleared the breakfast dishes together. "The house feels different, happy." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The house had felt like a stage set before, a place where people played at being a family. Now it felt like a home in the truest sense, a place where people belonged to each other, where love lived in both grand gestures and small kindnesses. That afternoon, while Emma napped and Jacob worked with the horses, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen with her mother's recipe book, planning the evening meal with a contentment she'd never expected to feel again. Not the desperate gratitude of someone rescued from poverty, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found her place in the world. When Jacob came in from the corrals, she was humming something she'd been doing more and more lately, without conscious thought. He paused in the doorway, watching her with an expression of such profound happiness that it took her breath away. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing. Everything. You." He crossed to where she stood, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this is all a dream." "If it is, I don't want to wake up," Sarah said, leaning back against his solid warmth. They stood like that for several minutes, wrapped in each other, and the golden afternoon light streaming through the kitchen windows. Outside, they could hear Emma talking to the horses, probably telling them about her parents' transformation and how pleased she was with the arrangement. "Jacob," Sarah said suddenly. "Thank you." "For what?" Sarah turned in his arms, looking up into the face that had become so dear to her. "For seeing possibilities when I could only see problems. For being patient when I was scared. For loving Emma as if she were your own. For giving us both a chance at happiness when I thought that was impossible." Jacob's smile was gentle, understanding. "Thank you for letting me love you, for trusting me with your heart, despite everything, for making this house a home instead of just a place to live." As evening approached and they gathered for dinner, Jacob carrying Emma on his shoulders, while she shrieked with delighted laughter, Sarah following behind with a contentment that felt like coming home after a long journey, Sarah realized that their strange beginning had led to something beautiful and real. Not the passionate romance of her youth, but something deeper and more durable. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and love that had grown slowly and steadily until it became the foundation of everything they were building together. That night, as they tucked Emma into bed, together both of them present for the stories and prayers that marked the end of her day, Sarah saw their reflection in the window glass, a family. Not a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience, but a real family bound by choice and love and the daily commitment to care for each other. "Are you happy, Mama?" Emma asked sleepily as Sarah smoothed the quilt over her small form. "Very happy, sweetheart." "Good. I think Papa Thomas would be happy too. I think he'd like Papa Jacob." The words might have been painful once, a reminder of loss and replacement. Instead, they felt like a blessing, permission from the past to embrace the future, recognition that love didn't diminish with sharing but expanded to encompass all the people who mattered. "I think you're right," Sarah said softly. "I think Papa Thomas would want us to be happy." As they settled into their shared bed that night, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate widow to reluctant bride, to genuine wife, each transformation had required courage, trust, and the willingness to believe that some risks were worth taking. "No regrets?" Jacob asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "None," Sarah replied, and meant it completely. "Only gratitude for wherever this leads us." Outside their window, the Wyoming wind sang across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of years they would face together, of a love that had started as pretense but had become the truest thing in both their lives. 6 months later, as spring painted the Wyoming territory in shades of green and gold, Sarah stood on the front porch, watching Emma and Jacob work together in the corral. Emma, now 7 and fearless on horseback, was learning to guide Thunder through increasingly complex maneuvers, while Jacob provided patient instruction from the ground. "Keep your hands steady, little one," Jacob called out. "Let him know you're confident, but don't fight him. You're partners, remember?" Partners. The word had come to define so much of their life, together Emma and Thunder, Jacob and his horses, and most importantly, Sarah and Jacob themselves. What had begun as a business arrangement had evolved into something far richer, a true partnership built on love, respect, and the daily choice to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. The photographer from Cheyenne would arrive soon to take the formal family portrait they'd commissioned, but Sarah found herself more interested in this candid Mamantha daughter, blooming with confidence and joy. her husband providing the patient guidance that had become his hallmark with both his horses and his family. The changes in Emma over the past months had been remarkable. The anxious, withdrawn child who'd clung to Sarah's skirts had been replaced by a confident little girl who attacked each day with enthusiasm and curiosity. She still spoke of Papa Thomas with love and remembrance, but Jacob had become simply Papa in her daily vocabulary, not a replacement for her father, but a father in his own right. "Mama, look!" Emma called out, guiding Thunder through a perfect figure-8 pattern. "Did you see how well we did that?" "Beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah called back, her heart swelling with pride and contentment. Jacob looked up from the corral, catching her eye and smiling with the warmth that had become as familiar as breathing. In his face, she could see the same deep satisfaction she felt, the recognition that they'd built something precious together, something that honored both their past and their future. Mrs. Chen appeared at Sarah's elbow, wiping her hands on her apron. "The photographer's wagon is coming up the road," she announced with the satisfaction of someone whose household ran like clockwork. "Everything is ready, the good china laid out, the parlor arranged just so, Emma's dress pressed and waiting." "Thank you." Sarah squeezed the older woman's arm gratefully. Mrs. Chen had become more than a housekeeper. She was a friend and confidant, someone who understood the delicate balance required to blend two lives into one harmonious whole. The formal portrait session took nearly 2 hours, the photographer positioning and repositioning them until he captured exactly what he was looking for. Sarah in her best blue dress, Jacob in his finest suit, Emma between them in white muslin with ribbons in her hair. But the image Sarah treasured most wasn't any of the formal it was the candid shot the photographer took at the end, when Emma had grown tired of sitting still and launched herself into Jacob's arms, causing all three of them to dissolve into laughter. That evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with stories and prayers, Sarah and Jacob sat on the porch as had become their custom. But tonight felt different, charged with a significance Sarah couldn't quite name. "A year ago," Jacob said quietly, "if someone had told me I'd be sitting here with a wife I loved and a daughter who calls me Papa, I'd have said they were dreaming. A year ago, I was planning to lose everything," Sarah replied. "The ranch, our home, Emma's security. I thought love was something that happened once in a lifetime, if you were lucky. And now," Sarah considered the question, thinking about all the ways her understanding of love had deepened and evolved. "Now I know that love isn't finite. It doesn't diminish when shared, it grows. I loved Thomas with the passion of youth, and that love gave me Emma and taught me what happiness could look like. But what we have is different, steadier, more durable, built on choice rather than chance, on daily commitment rather than momentary emotion." Jacob reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the outline of his grandmother's ring. "I used to think marriage was about finding someone who completed you, made you whole. But that's not what we have, is it?" "No," Sarah agreed. "We were both whole people when we found each other. What we have is two complete individuals choosing to build something together, choosing to be stronger as a team than we could be alone." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. "I can't sleep," she announced. "There are too many exciting thoughts in my head." Jacob chuckled, lifting her onto his lap. "What kind of exciting thoughts?" "Thoughts about the photograph and how we looked like a real family in all the pictures. Thoughts about Thunder and how fast he's growing. Thoughts about whether Buttercup might have a foal next spring." Emma settled against Jacob's chest with the boneless trust of a beloved child. "Happy thoughts." "Happy thoughts are the best kind," Sarah said, smoothing Emma's hair. "But even happy thoughts need to rest sometimes, so they can grow into happy dreams. Will you tell me a story about princesses and horses and families that live happily ever after?" Sarah and Jacob exchanged a look over Emma's head, seeing their own contentment reflected in each other's eyes. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, "there was a princess who thought her story had ended when her kingdom fell into trouble. But then a kind knight rode up to her castle with an offer that seemed too good to be true. As Sarah wove the tale, transforming their own story into the kind of fairy tale Emma loved, she marveled at how much their lives had changed. Not just the external circumstances, the financial security, the comfortable home, the social respectability of marriage, but the internal landscape as well. Where once there had been fear and desperation, now there was hope and joy. Where once there had been loneliness and isolation, now there was partnership and belonging. "And did they live happily ever after?" Emma asked drowsily when the story ended. "They lived as happily as any real people can," Sarah replied. "Which is to say, they had good days and difficult days, challenges and triumphs, but they faced them all together, and that made all the difference." Emma nodded sagely, as if this answer satisfied her in ways that simple fairy tale endings couldn't. "I think that's better than happily ever after. I think that's really ever after." After they'd carried Emma back to bed and tucked her in properly, Sarah and Jacob stood together in their bedroom, looking out at the moonlit prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere out there was Sarah's old ranch, carefully maintained by Jacob's hired men and waiting for the day when Emma might want to claim her father's legacy. Closer, corrals held horses that Emma would grow up with, fields that would provide for their family's future, a land that would witness whatever joys and sorrows lay ahead. "Do you ever miss it?" Jacob asked suddenly. "The passionate romance, the grand gestures, the kind of love that burns bright and fast?" Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about Thomas and the intensity of their young love, the way it had felt like the most important thing in the universe. "I treasure what Thomas and I had," she said finally. "It gave me Emma, taught me what it meant to be loved completely, showed me that happiness was possible. But I don't miss the uncertainty, the way that kind of love makes everything else seem secondary." She turned to face Jacob fully, seeing in his steady presence the anchor she hadn't known she needed. "What we have feels more sustainable. Love that grows stronger with time instead of burning out. Partnership that can weather practical challenges as well as emotional ones. I spent so many years thinking that anything less than passionate romance was settling for second best. Now I realize that what we have might actually be first best, just different from what I expected." Jacob's smile was warm with understanding. "I love you, Sarah Stone. Not desperately, not obsessively, but completely, with all my heart and all my hope for our future." "I love you too, Jacob Stone. For all the reasons I never expected to matter: your kindness, your patience, your strength, your capacity to see possibilities where others see problems. For being the man who saved us and then let us save ourselves. For giving Emma a father and me a partner and both of us a family." As they settled into bed together, wrapped in the quiet contentment of people who'd found their place in the world, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate proposal from a stranger, a marriage built on practical necessity, feelings that had grown slowly and carefully until they'd become the foundation of everything worthwhile in her life. It wasn't the story she'd planned to live, but it had become the story she treasured. Not a fairy tale with its neat beginning, middle, and end, but something richer and more complex: a real life, with real people, building real love one day at a time. Outside their window, the Wyoming wind sang its eternal song across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of years they would face together, of a love that had started as pretense but had become the truest thing in both their lives. And in the small bedroom of a ranch house in the middle of nowhere, three people who'd found each other against all odds slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that some stories don't end, they simply grow deeper and richer with each passing day.